Queering Mexican History, Michoacán, 1604, Heran Todos. This was part of the title of Seb Tortorici's 2007 article. It comes to us from a quote he cites in a 1604 criminal court case from the Morelia Municipal Archives. It discusses a case concerning two purépecha men who were being persecuted for committing the so-called pecado nefando, which referred to homosexual sodomy. The case involved Simpliciano Cuine and Pedro Cuini, who were caught in a temazcal, let's say, making tortillas. What began as a case involving two men turned into a case that exposed 11 other indigenous men who were also making tortillas with Cuini. Cuini's testimony reveals some interesting details about the ways indigenous men who had sex with men lived their lives within the first 100 years after the Spanish conquest. The 1604 sodomy case from Valladolid, today known as Morelia and Michoacán, provides evidence of what Tortorici refers to as sodomitical subcultures. In other words, these indigenous men who had sex with men, even in colonial times, knew where to find each other. As Pedro Cuini was being tortured by Spanish officials, he revealed the names of other men he slept with, where they met, and who, quote, served as the women. Some, like Cuini, were in their 20s, and others were in their 30s. One was 15 years old. Sometimes these encounters took place in groups. Cuini reported that he made tortillas with a servant named Joaquin Sisiki, while two other men were watching. One was a cook named Marcos, who was already deceased, and the other was a young painter from Uruapan named Miguel. Back in Sinsunsan, Cuini also participated as a spectator and watched as Pedro Cinso made tortillas with another man named Huachinque. Interestingly, Cuini's testimony also provides probable evidence of a man who lived his life as a sex worker. He also admitted to committing carnal acts with a Francisco Conduyi, a baker from Sinsunsan who reportedly also made a living from making tortillas with other men. His house was apparently known as a place where men went to go seek out other men, perhaps a tortilleria, we may say. What probably made the testimony even more scandalous was that Conduyi's house was right next to a church. According to Cuini, the male sex worker was previously accused of homosexual sodomy, but before Spanish officials could get to him and imprison him, he escaped by going out of town. At some point, Conduyi later continued his work by sneaking back into Sinsunsan. Luckily for him, he managed to escape again, since Spanish officials were not able to locate, interrogate, and persecute him the second time in 1604. Queering Mexican History,
Michoacán, 1604, Part 4.
This criminal case also gives details into which of these men were what we would call today top and bottom, or activo and pasivo.
Of course, they didn't use these terms in colonial times. The Spanish court case simply refers to the men who bottomed as those who served as a woman.
In the group meeting involving Marcos and Miguel, the case records that Joaquin Sisiki served Cuini as a woman on two separate occasions. It also states that Cuini even, let's say, left him a glass of milk while inside of him. Thanks, buddy. This language is also used in his encounter with another indigenous man named Miguel, who invited Cuini to his colegio,
which back then was a place where Catholic missionaries like the Franciscans studied.
There on the kitchen floor, Miguel, quote, served him as a woman. The male sex worker Francisco Conduyi seems to have been what we call today verse. Cuini says that he saw Conduyi serve as the woman multiple times and also saw that there were men who, quote, served him as if they were his women. Despite the fact that these tortilleros, as I've referred to them in this video, were men, the court case described the men receiving the phallus as the woman. An interesting point that Tortorici brings up is that we don't know if referring to the bottom in feminine terms was something that only the Spaniards did. Is it possible that the purépecha witnesses being interrogated also referred to the bottom as the one who, quote, served as the woman? We won't really know for sure, considering that the testimonies of the indigenous men being interrogated were given in purépecha. However, the criminal court case was recorded in Spanish, so the phrase serving as a woman was probably inserted by the Spanish notary. The stories of the purépecha men being persecuted for homosexual sodomy in 1604 gives us a glimpse into the colonial world that these men lived in. According to Simpliciano Cuine's testimony, he met Pedro Cuini while talking to two black men who sold him pulque and wine. As he drank, Cuini kept pressuring him to buy some cloth that he was selling. At some point, Simpliciano got really drunk, and Queenie recommended that he should go sleep in a nearby temazcal. Since public drunkenness and vagrancy was a crime punishable under colonial rule, Simpliciano agreed to take a nap in the temazcal. He went in first, but says he suddenly found Queenie on top of him. While Simpliciano claimed that he was just an innocent victim of Queenie's advances, the people who caught them tell a different story. The 14-year-old nephew of a priest and a Nahuatl-speaking servant named Gaspar caught the men in a temazcal, making tortillas, while out looking for a horse. They heard sounds and caught one of the men, quote, thrusting as if he were on top of a woman, then reported them to Spanish authorities. In the interrogations of the indigenous men persecuted as sodomites, many of them, like Simpliciano, defended themselves by claiming that they were either drunk, young and naive, or just simply pressured into doing it. Despite witness testimonies claiming the opposite, it made sense that they feigned innocence in order to save themselves from punishment. Out of the 6 men that eventually ended up being convicted, 4 were executed. Pedro Queenie's life was spared for exposing the other men that he slept with. Those who weren't so lucky were sentenced to riding on top of horses, while a town crier paraded them around the city, yelling out the crimes that they were guilty of committing. Then they were placed in a pillory and kept there until they died, and their bodies were then burned. Nevertheless, their stories live on to show that men who had sex with men existed even during the first 100 years of the Spanish conquest of Michoacán.